Hello, St. Mary's. I'm coming to you from my new office, which I'm not really settled in. But as soon as I pulled up the video, I realized just how completely stark this is. So this is really unsettling to me. But nevertheless, so I'm going to apologize. And actually, we're not going to stay here today. I'm actually going to take you on a field trip. But before we do that, I just wanted to recap a little bit about what we talked about yesterday. Yesterday, we talked about living the gospel, and the gospel is not what we do, the gospel is what Christ does on the cross. Yesterday, we talked about living the gospel in a cruciform or a cross shaped way. That the gospel is not just the message, it's also the way we follow that message. And so, as Christ gave himself, so we present ourselves, in the words that Paul uses, as a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God. This is your spiritual act of worship. And so, a cruciform life is a life of giving ourselves for others. And a cruciform way of doing church is about giving ourselves for others. In other words, not everything, even in church, is about us. No, actually, church is in the business of making it about others because we seek to present the gospel, to witness to the gospel at every possible opportunity. Now, I cut my sermon a little short yesterday, believe it or not, but I had a couple of examples that I wanted to offer to you of what it looks like. What would it be if we as a church were living a fully cruciform life? And so I'd like to offer three ways of doing that. And to do so, I'd like to take you on a field trip. So why don't you come with me? So the first place that I wanted to bring you to was here in the vestry, where we've been experimenting for the last couple of weeks, and we'll continue to do so, with a new way of greeting folks and inviting folks into the vestry for a time of fellowship and hanging out. Information desk here right behind me. And the lesson I want everyone to learn from this is that the gospel we don't start proclaiming the gospel in the sanctuary. We start proclaiming the gospel the minute people hit our door. We've all experienced a warm greeting from time to time, that someone has greeted us, met us with a handshake, a word of encouragement, hey, how you doing? Even a warm cup of coffee. That may very well be the gospel for someone, just experiencing a little bit of love. And so greeting then, our greeters are not just about saying hi, it is about sharing the gospel with every person who comes inside our door. To say that you are valued. You are so valued that you deserve of our time and our energy and our attention because you are a priority to God. That's what we want people to walk out of here saying. I am a priority to them because I am a priority to God. And so the internal monologue for our greeters that are shaped by the gospel doesn't go, well, here's some coffee and there's your bulletin, but rather, I'm committed to greeting each and every person with as much love and affection as I can muster because I want to be the someone through whom God makes a difference in someone else's life. So that's what greeting is about, sharing the gospel from the minute we come in. And I want to encourage each of us, if you're not a part of the greeter ministry, and I invite you to join in to help us share the gospel to each person who comes in. Join me in spot number 2, will you? The second place I wanted to bring it was to our small group environments. And that could be anything. It can be small groups of youth, as we're down here in the youth room. It could be small groups of adults, small groups of children, just anywhere that we aren't in large group, but we're also not by ourselves, that middle ground where we gather with one another. And here's the thing I need everybody to know. All spiritual formation is based in the gospel, which means it always begins in Christ. So we don't start by saying you need to do better or here's good morals. It always starts with the cross of Christ. Here's what God has done for you. And so each person who comes into contact with any one of our our small group environments should be saying, wow, all they ever do is talk about Jesus and what they mean to him. And so as an example of this, you're like, well, how does that play out? Like, how do we do that in a small group environment? Well, consider this. Take one of my favorite Bible stories. Perhaps it's yours as well. I love the story of David and Goliath. So if we tell the story of David and Goliath and say, be like David, you need to be more brave and bold, that's moralistic. That's actually making the issue us rather than God. But we can teach it as, no, Jesus is the new David. And Jesus is coming on behalf of us scared Israelites, and Jesus is conquering the Goliaths in our lives. You see the difference? That is an entirely different message that is based not on what we are to do, but on what Christ is doing for us. And ultimately, David slays the biggest Goliath, sin, death, and the devil, in his death on the cross. And whether we do that for children, our youth, adults, or even older adults, we should always be hearing the story of what Jesus is doing for us in every one of those environments. Now we move on to place number 3. And our last spot is here in the sanctuary, and I'm going to sit in the back since I never get to sit here. But I want to consider what it means to do the gospel from the pew. Now, worship is one of the places where it's really not about us. Because we don't come to worship to get something. Though certainly we seek that. I have no problem with us seeking that. We want to experience God. But what we primarily come to do when we worship is to offer something to God. We give our worship. Now, one of the things that's beautiful about worshiping our God is that God does turn it back around on us. He does. He's very generous. God gives of gifts all the time. But we come and worship primarily to give worship regardless of how we feel, because God is worthy of our praise. But our God is one who turns things back on us. And so our question then as we come to worship is, who has God got in mind today? Sometimes that is us. And we talked about this yesterday. Sometimes that is us, but let's be honest. Most of the time it's actually not. The sermon or the songs or the prayers, whatever. How many Sundays a year do we go and you're like, it's fine. Well, that's still okay. There's still gospel to be done even when worship isn't about us, because it's always for someone. Christ is living and active. He's moving in people's lives, and whether it's ours or somebody else's, God is moving. And so our job is to figure out where to pay attention. And so we need to be part of curating spaces where other people can experience God. And there is someone every Sunday who needs to be in a space like this, not a lone space, but space in a community where they can spend time with God. And we can hold that space. We can be a part of holding that space for others, even at the cost of our preferences. So we may not like a sermon, or the songs may not land for us, or the prayer may be a little weird, or the service might go a little long, or communion might be a little funny. But I guarantee you, because I talk to people every single week who are like, wow, I needed that this week, we can hold that space for others, even if it's not about us. Because that is gospel. Gospel is being that living sacrifice for others. And may we be the someone or the someones who create an environment where God speaks into the life of another. Now, back to the office. So friends, I want to invite you to consider these 3 spaces: our vestry with our greeters, small group environments and our teachers, and worshipers in the pew. And consider how, or maybe even consider one of your spaces. Maybe we didn't touch on something that's meaningful to you and you're thinking through these things. But I invite you to consider the question, how can you lean into the places where you put your bodies, yourself, in service of another? And friends, I'm telling you, not only does that grow somebody else, but I'm telling you, it's that when we participate in the cross in this way, I'm telling you, it grows us. Our greatest growth is when we are in service to others. And not only that, but it grows our community. It grows our church. We do become more friendly, more generous, more creative, more thoughtful, because we're always looking for the places that God is working. And when our awareness is up for that, we are only limited by where Christ will take us. We're not limited by ourselves, but only what Christ is doing within us. And so I want to invite you to consider that in your week this week, and as we engage with the church this week, and even come back in for worship. Let's be about giving ourselves for others and seeing what it is that God does with that. And friends, if you have a further thought, if you have questions, if you've experienced this in some way, as always, please come back, leave a comment, let us know. Let's keep the conversation going. But friends, until we're able to chat about this again, peace and good, y'all.